And I want to thank you all for having me here for this series. I was here a couple of years ago to actually do a research talk, but this is such a tremendous honor to actually come here and talk about what it was like to be a graduate student here and the impact that had for me and my training. I'll talk about what I tried to carry with me that I thought was fantastic training and things that I changed because I think graduate students are under much more pressure than certainly I was and certainly John was. You know, we go back, the bar keeps on rising. And so I'll talk a bit about some of the things that I do now as an advisor thinking back of how I was trained here. So having said that, grad students stop me, ask me questions. I really want to hear from you. I know we can talk afterwards, but I also like to talk in the actual room. So feel free to, any questions you have, to stop me. I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek. The official title is here about Feminist Interventions, but this Ask a Feminist. I put that up there because, sometimes we feel like we're in a special time. We're under a lot of pressure as educators, especially with a transition in government that some of us feel a little bit nervous about, but to put it mildly. But at the same time, I think if you ask anybody who has taught a lot, especially I would say feminists, especially in feminist classrooms, but also critical race theorists, critical geographers, that we've seen trying times before, and we came through them. And so especially for the graduate students who are in classrooms, either TAing or teaching your own classes, there are techniques, and it's hard, but it's important that we do this because there are terrible things that are happening, such as bans. And as hard as it is for us, it's better for us to be in the classroom and be there for our students, and it's not the first time this has happened. So that sounds like grim news, but it's actually, I think, positive news for all of you. This is what we do. Right? And so that's why I say ask a feminist, because we've seen it before. You know, I can talk a little bit more about that in terms of my trajectory as a scholar, having been. I was actually listed in the. Let me make sure I have this right. The Americans for Freedom, which is a conservative group of students that I was listed in their national handbook, along with my colleague Andrew Carlton for his climate science class, My Gender and Geography, to be banned. And I was only 2 years out of here, and I thought, I'm dead, right? Tenure is never going to happen. And what was really wonderful was they actually put it in my tenure file, my department, because they thought it was such a wonderful thing to have happened, that the people would think that I was such a motivated teacher that I got banned by a certain group. So I don't advise that for you in your careers, but at the same time, again, it's the point that my colleagues in climate science, myself, we've been through this more, and I can talk a little bit more about maybe even at the beer belly about the pressure of academic freedom that came on women's studies departments across the country, and having your lectures tape recorded and then turned over to the state senate. So these are kind of things that have happened in my career. But I do tie that back to my training here, that I did come out of here, I think, a pretty decent teacher. Thank you, John. And the Maxwell School for those courses that the Maxwell classes, I think they're still going on. Really, I hit the ground running in terms of my teaching coming out of the Maxwell School, and I think that really helped deal with some of the pressures that we're dealing with today. Okay, here's the more raunchy part of grad school. This is it's a walk down memory lane for some of us. This is the cohort, right? And you all, when you're in grad school, you have your cohort, and that is really important. It makes grad school, which is very stressful, but it also makes it fun. I was the only fool who clearly didn't put down her drink when this picture was being taken. I wasn't the only one there drinking. But I will talk a little bit later about the pressures that are on, in terms of graduate school, and talk about fun stuff, but also what we would call now self-care, which I think is really important for graduate students, and start to practicing early on how to take care of yourself under stress. This particular group, we all started taking yoga together, which was really ugly and comical, but fun, So we actually started, There are people here you probably recognize. Didier DeLyzer here, that's Joe Sharp in the back waving. Mitch Rose, Ewan Haig. And we really made, we decided as a cohort that as much as the pressure, and there's ways to release pressure, such as heavy drinking, that we decided that we would do sometimes, but not all of the time, right? And that we wanted to get through this and get through our careers in a rather healthy way. And I can talk more about that. I think at some point, as you start to age in the discipline, everybody has their own health crises. I had one 2 years ago, and it really made me realize that you do have to take care of yourself when you do this kind of work. It's really important because the stress levels are really high. There's a couple pictures of me here in the field. You can see 2 different masters as well as doing my PhD research. During the time when I was here, it was a really exciting time. We were working, and I'm sure everybody that came in so far. And by the way, thank you for quitting at the 90s. I feel really young being the last person to come in, so that's made me, despite my introduction, that's made me feel very great. But there were certain things, new forms of social theory, and feminist geography as a grad student was really at the forefront when I was here. It was very, very exciting. Really wonderful things were happening here. I remember Nancy Duncan had a colloquium series on, I think she called it body space, which was really something different at the time. So there was this, and Jillian Rose, Heidi Nass, I could go on and on, Cindy Katz, we're all here. And we got to spend time with them and talk about, because we didn't have feminists. I think I actually started the grad class here on gender. But we didn't have grad classes, but we figured out ways, and through help from people like Nancy, we figured out ways to do some informal education in that way. We also had a very intensive field class. Most of us were going off to do very long stints in the field. But this was also a time where field work, Cindy Katz's article had just come out about where is the field? And this idea that the field is not something you just go to and come back from, So there was critical field studies, fieldwork studies happening at this time too. I think Didier DeLyzer has become the expert in the country on that. She leads workshops now at the AAG. If you have an opportunity to take one with her, I'd highly recommend it. And so we were doing a lot of reading on our own. I now teach a feminist methodologies class, which absolutely comes out of those early conversations that I had here on how to do responsible field work, and actually even raise the question maybe at times we don't need to do field work, which seems at the time you would never raise that question when I was a graduate student. But when is it inappropriate to actually, when can there be further violence if you're actually just by asking questions and going to a place? I just made a decision recently not to interview a group of people for that reason. And it makes total sense to me now, but I think 20 years ago, I would have been under a lot of pressure to defend that decision. So that's the kind of things that were going on here 20 years ago. Who's not in the picture is a good colleague of mine, Holly Hapke. One thing that you all weren't very good at was training us to get grants at that time. And so, and Holly is now, she's been a program officer for the last 3 years at NSF. And she's really good at that. And so even now, and I just put in an NSF to study Brexit in Northern Ireland. And although it didn't get funded, she's been very encouraging and has been helping so that the cohort doesn't end, is what I'm trying to say. Like, we are together, we still support each other. The other thing I want to point out is the cohort goes off the screen too, is for the graduate students. So I can remember the first AAG that I went to that we didn't travel as a bunch of grad students as a swarm, like all, going to each other's papers, which is important. You want to support each other. But, having lunch with Karen Till, right, because we both studied nationalism. And that's where my cohort outside of this department started also, and are still incredibly important to me in terms of the types of questions we raise, but also in terms of supporting each other over the years in the discipline. So that's the cohort slide. All right, as a good feminist researcher, I'm going to talk a little bit about positionality. And positionality as a researcher coming to grad school. What I now know, with my sage advice, is that pretty much everybody feels out of place when they come to grad school, but we don't admit it to each other. And I felt really out of place because I'm a blue-collar scholar, as Alpha Cravey likes to call us, you know, and so that meant for me, I had certain insecurities that were not easily, but were overcome. Like John talked about correcting my grammar. John taught me how to write here. Writing is a skill. You can learn how to write. My committee at the time, this is something I imported at Penn State, a strong committee structure to work with students, because you can't know everything about everything. And so Jim Duncan and John Agnew taught me how to read critically. John also, as being an ethnographer, taught me how to do those kind of things when I went to the field. But still there was this feeling of, do I really belong here? And this is actually, this is where I grew up in the Bronx in New York. It's called the Amalgamated, which is labor housing. And it was started from garment workers from the Lower East Side who moved to the Bronx and created this place, which I grew up was quite magical. I recently was at a dinner party, and a historian, who's a labor historian, said, "You grew up in the Amalgamated," and I finally figured out what it feels like to be the subject of research, you know. And so they were like, he goes, "What was it like?" And I said, "Like anywhere else, I suppose," you know. And this is what we do as geographers, right? When we go to the field, we come down in scale, and so what people think might be presumptions about place, you know, that's one of the reasons to actually be in the field. But I thought what I would do is to kind of point to this a little bit, is that Alpha, when I think it was it was a couple of AGs ago. They're all blurring now. I can't remember where they are. But she actually convened a panel of looking at intersectional blue-collar scholars. And many of you probably know, but she asked us to put some of our thoughts together about this. I just thought I'd read a little of what I was talking about, because I think to kind of make this point about feeling out of place in a place that you study place, right? So I called this "The Bridge and Tunnel New Yorker Enters the Ivory Tower." And so bridge and tunnel is a pejorative term for residents of New York City who have to pass through a tunnel or go over a bridge to enter Manhattan. Culturally, if you grew up in any borough other than Manhattan, it was assumed that you were less sophisticated, had less money, tasteless fashion style, and most importantly, you were socially restricted by a New York City accent. Interestingly, as a daughter of two working-class Irish immigrants, I was utterly unaware of social class. I lived in a beautiful apartment in the Bronx, had access to a major New York City park, enjoyed the company of my friends and my two loving parents. It was an idyllic childhood. As an adult, I graduated from a local college and had a successful career in advertising. But it wasn't until I came back to graduate school that I felt out of place. While being mindful of my privileged position as a white Western woman, but it was clear that the barriers that I had encountered as I entered the academy as a graduate student, such as lacking adequate cultural knowledge, when my work and social practices were jarring with my working class sensibilities, I had trouble with theory in the beginning. But I overcame that and understood how to explain the experiences of people with the help of theory. But in the beginning, it was somewhat overwhelming to me. And my coming to terms with my past and present cultural locations in my research practice. So let's fast forward 18 years, and this is the latter part of the story. So several years ago, I went to see the film Selma, as many of us did, and I was in Manhattan, and later a group of us went to a neighboring cafe. It was a large farm table in the middle where many people from the film had poured into, and typical of Manhattan, everybody was sitting at the table, all chatting about the film that we had seen. It was what can only be described as a chance encounter. I was seated across from pretty much my mirror image, a middle-aged woman who was also an academic, but she was teaching at the Fashion Institute of Technology. We both even had our obligatory scarves on that middle-aged scholars have to wear. And then when my friends and I explained that we lived in Riverdale, a local Bronx neighborhood, I actually recently bought an apartment back where I grew up, and for a lot of reasons, and that has worked out quite wonderfully. She said her daughter had attended the Riverdale Country School, an independent college preparatory day school in New York City that has a distinguished list of alums such as John F. Kennedy and Carly Simon, just to name a few. At which point I said, oh, my mom worked at that school. And with great excitement, she said, I wonder if my daughter was in her class. And I said with a smile, I don't think so, because my mom was the cleaning woman. At which time she averted her eyes, and that was the end of the conversation. Now, 20 years later, what I realized is that this woman wasn't averting her eyes from me because she didn't want to engage with me. She felt out of place. And so that's the interesting thing that I find about graduate school, about coming here, is that it's all sorts of different people who come, but we have a common bond of interest. In this cohort that I showed, we had a very strong interest in social justice. And we all came from very different backgrounds. We all had our insecurities. Joe to this day, Joe Sharp will say, everybody hated me, I was so young, And so she felt her age. I could go through every one of us and someone would say something about why they didn't fit in here, but together we fit, right? Together we were able to make it work. And we are all, for the most part, still together in one way or another. Even if it's just, often when you see clusters of people talking at the AAG and you think, like, what's that about? That's what that's about, right? It's friendship, it's reassurance, you guys will be together. Even those who may leave after a master's degree, I'm still in contact with those folks who went on either to the workforce or to do PhDs in other places. So anyway, so that's a little bit of my story. Okay, this is for the grads. And let me make sure I've got, okay. So when I was in grad school, sometimes you feel like you're losing yourself a little bit, or you're being molded and shaped and something new is coming out of it. But I did feel like, as I said when I first came, sometimes my sensibility of why is theory practical? How is this going to change the world? And it takes a while, and sometimes I still think about it, and I think that that's a good thing, to constantly wondering how we're going to make this very privileged position that we're all in, right? And I probably didn't realize that when I was here, but we are in such incredibly privileged positions, and how can we have the time to think and teach and read what we want in order to make it make sense in the world, however we make sense of it in the world, whatever your subfield in geography might be. As I said, I take a lot from these days, even though sometimes they were quite painful to me because I was scared. You don't know what's going to happen on the other end, right? You're working really hard. No promises can be made. I can say that my whole cohort, it's this very strange thing. You're friends, but then you're often interviewing against each other also for jobs. And somehow we had to work that through ourselves and find that place where we could all support each other. And eventually we all did get jobs. And we, and got the kind of jobs that we wanted. Or got jobs, I didn't know I wanted to work at Penn State. It was the job I was offered. And I'm lucky that, it worked out. It worked out to be a very good place for me. One of the stories, Jake might not even remember this, but one of the things that was really moving to me when I was a grad student, Jake was here and he was just interviewing. And he was up in the hallway and we just started chatting, and I was in the final throes of writing my dissertation, so I looked probably pretty haggard. And Jake looked at me and he said, it's always going to be hard, but the hardest is when you're a grad student, because of that unknown. And that is really, and I've passed that on to so many grad students, because it is hard, the career is hard, there's lots of demands, and the more senior you get, the more demands will be made on you, especially in terms of administration. But have a job, right? And so that unknown area, and I've always appreciated that, Jake, and I get to officially thank you for that now. But I think that it is a really hard period of time when you're a grad student, but there is a way through it, and your faculty will help you get through that, your committees and your faculty and the department. Part of this also, this was definitely, I saw this chart and I cracked up, because this is definitely my story, right? That you can't quit because you've got too much invested in it already, you know? And there are those moments when you think, you know, oh, okay, I've got 2 chapters done. How am I going to get to the next chapter? I remember once John Mercer, I was in my office and I was working on my dissertation here late, you know, teaching during the day, here late at night, writing. And he looked at me and said, you know, Lorraine, you're going to get done. And I thought, oh, I got something. He can tell I have something, you know. And I just said, why, John, do you think I'm going to get done? He goes, because you're just darn angry enough. Apparently I was hitting the keys with such volume that it was disturbing him. I was actually in Margie's office, right? And, you know, and he's like, could you hold it down? And so, but it was true. Like he said, he could tell that because I was just so into it with the way, you know, that I would get done. But in my low moments, I had these fantasies of, well, it's okay. What if I don't get the academic job? I'm just going to go work at the UN. I bet I can get the Nobel Peace Prize. Like, obviously, I was not operating in reality at all. but at the same time, you know, it was, you know, I was always afraid to hope for what I have now because I didn't want to be disappointed. You know, and I think if I can give you any advice, it's to, you know, set your mark on what you want. My graduate students at Penn State are absolutely remarkable. They come in the door, they know what they want. They're like, this is the kind of job I want to get. And I'm just awed. I'm in awe of their confidence. And my God, they do it. You know, they're like, I'm going to get that NSF grant. I'm going to get, you know, and they do it. You know, and so I think that, and it's not that they're not humble. It's not that they don't know the realities, but they have it in their eye. You know, and so I think it's okay to be, especially as women, right? Because, you know, we're not supposed to historically have that type of ambition. And I see it with the young women I advise now, and it's absolutely fabulous. So, you know, decide what you want and go after it and ask for help. That was another thing that I tended not to do. I was fiercely independent, but that meant I was also afraid to ask for help, you know. And so there are structures to help. When it was, when Jim Duncan was here, he took the videotape and he posted to his Facebook page, and so it really went out that these discussions were going on, and so it was discovered that I was doing the 90s, and so I had kind of kept it kind of quiet. And at the AAG this year, so many of my cohort came up to me going, remember to tell them, very excited, remember to tell them this, remember to tell them that. And one of the things that was very clear, about 6 people came up to me, was they wanted you to know that we tried as a cohort to do something different as a cohort. And one of the things I think we were quite successful at is that we wanted to come out, still be in contact with each other, and have mentoring structures for those who came behind us. So I constantly refer people to Didia's, she also does writing seminars. The woman got her master's thesis published into a book on Ramona while she was writing her dissertation, right? You know, and she's an incredible writer. And so we've had her come to Penn State. We've had her work with the geography students. The same thing with Jo Sharp. You know, she's an amazing mentor. She's really wonderful in her breadth of the discipline and being able to bring people together and talk over, let's say, subfields. And we've had her come and do that. And so that, you know, we can run workshops for all the grad students at Penn State. And so we kind of created this bond that we wanted to do something together as we move forward. And I think we are fulfilling that. We still don't have the, you know, the wing in the White House on feminist geography yet, but we're working on it, you know, so we're trying anyway. As part of grad school and this feeling of being overwhelmed, so I said, you know, self-care is also really important. It's easy to fall into, this is the Paris Commune. I'm going to sit around, I'm going to drink and smoke and sound really smart, you know, and we did that, you know, and so, but at the same time, it's the first stage in having a healthy career. And so, like I said, we started a yoga class together, and it doesn't matter that we were terrible. I still practice yoga because of that class. I'm still terrible at it. But it's still, you know, it keeps me calm. under the pressures of the job that I have now. And so, these practices, whether you do them together as a cohort or you do them individually, are really, really important. We have a great feminist term for it now called self-care, but basically it means, and in women's studies, they're doing all sorts of amazing things. They have group meditation sessions, they have going to tea together and not talking about work. We also have writing groups where we go to the same room and we just write. We don't even talk about our work, but we write and we take breaks, we have tea, and then we go back to it again, because writing can be very lonely. And even if you're co-authoring, you're still writing, and so it can be a lonely experience. And so there's ways to make it less lonely that we've been trying. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of research I do and how it started here and what it might have and how it has evolved. This is the first slide, or the paper I presented at the AHG this year, and my co-author is Jenna Kristen, who's a PhD candidate that works with me. And one of the things that has made writing much more fun for me is not necessarily working on my graduate student stuff, but trying to find this commonality of things that we're interested in. She has been doing her field research in Houston. She's looking at the pipeline from school to the military by the junior ROTC for people of color, saying, if you don't go into the military, you'll probably end up in prison. Right? And so she had complete access to the local school district. She's done an arts-based methodology, working with kids about this, and also working with the JROTC. But she got very involved with Black Lives Matters in Houston, and around the time of the Sandra Bland case, when Sandra Bland died in custody. I had a case I probably talked about last time I was here, of Lavina Johnson, who has been, now, as you know, with Sandra Bland, the designation was suicide. With Lavina Johnson, the military, it is very clear through independent autopsies that she was murdered and raped, but the designation is suicide. So we brought these two women together where the state has rendered, saying it's not their responsibility for these deaths based on what they see as the equivalent of mental illness, right? And we put this paper together. It was in sessions on Bob Nixon's Slow and Fast Violence, where I think he could have definitely given feminist scholars much more credit for that concept. But we pulled it together, and we're going to publish this paper together, which isn't at the core of the book I'm working on, and it's not even in her dissertation. But it's something that came together that we felt, and it also will help Jenna on the job market with one more publication. And it also helps me because she makes me think in different ways about my own research. So we bring our research projects together. But that's, when I graduated from here, I was working on the conflict in Northern Ireland. I actually did this thing, which I would probably yell at my students to do. I did a Wardle, right? And this is based on the paper I just talked to you about, right? And I did some other experiments. Like I looked at my first publication that I published when I was here. And the construction of this is very different, right? Up here, different. It's not even that it's different words, like public and private space, conflict, war. It's much looser. It's much less tight. And there's not this big overarching theme, right? So I think what has happened is I got incredibly great training here as a scholar. Dissertations have to be focused. But through my work over the years, and also doing this kind of writing with my grad students, the project has become bigger, and I'm sure all of the faculty here would probably say the same thing, that I'm working on violence with one grad student who works on intimate partner violence. Jenna's work on the violence of structural violence of education. I have another student who's working on violence and development. So I didn't even realize this until I did this little exercise myself, and that's why I'm very grateful for this invitation, because it's actually a time to really reflect on what you do and where you've come. And so I think what's interesting that over the 20-year period, I'm still working on violence, but I'm working on it in a very different way. And I've expanded my toolbox, but I definitely had a solid toolbox while I was here. Okay, yeah, so I'll talk a little. I have a really, for those of you who are really good with graphics, I apologize. I am not, and so I did not, that's another thing I didn't learn here. But I think I put this together because I kind of also want to show the evolution, not just of me, but also as the field. When I was here, we were talking about feminist geography. And we don't talk about feminist geography anymore because I think what's happened, which I think is a really positive thing, is that like when I was on the job market, you would see ads for feminist geographers. You don't see that anymore. What you see are all the different areas, let's say in human geography, where they say we also invite feminist theorists, right? So that it has actually moved its way, the kind of way that I've been trained to think as a feminist scholar is all through the discipline now. And so, and to me, this is a really healthy and wonderful thing. And I think, when we were in the forefront of that here, I think. The other thing that I think is really interesting, too, is that I was in that in-between space between cultural and political geography, and this was a great place to be in that in-between space. But in the U.S., that kind of changed. In the UK, it changed. In the U.S., it changed. I know Jim probably talked to you about the kind of work that he did in terms of the Berkeley School, but there were some other turns that happened also, where cultural geography in the U.S. was becoming a little bit more traditional, and in the UK, it was getting much more focused on affect. And then, again, I was out of place, right? And so I was like, I don't quite fit in here. And so I started identifying, and through the help of, again, mentorship is really important. Lynn Staley, right, who was not here, who was not on my committee, but I learned very valuable lessons of reaching out to people coming from behind. And she called me up, was organizing, can you imagine this? She called me up and said, I need help organizing a conference in Rome. Yeah, I'll do that, and she put me in charge of food, right? So, this was an incredible gesture of kindness. And so, and she said, well, you're at that, that cultural end of political geography, and I need to bring those people into the conference, right? And so, so I got to pick all the restaurants, but, and we got to go 5 days ahead of time to test everything in all the restaurants. So that's the beauty of the small conference versus the AAJ. So there's a big shift in how I identify myself. So, and then came working with one of my cohort, with Joe Sharp, working on what would a feminist geopolitics look like? Because we were tired of going to the AAG and hearing a lot about geopolitics that wasn't including the feminist work that we were seeing happening in political geography that was definitely geopolitical work. And so there was an evolution there that I think I'm probably the most proud of. And my students have taken this idea of feminist geopolitics and run with it in so many ways. Jenna is now, through her art-based methodology, doing creative geopolitics. And also as part of this, I now teach a class, as I mentioned, in feminist methodology, which the roots of that came from the discussions I was having here as a grad student with my cohort. So as part of that, when I just talked about the Sandra Bland case study that I'm working on in this book that I'm working, I made a conscious decision not to interview the parents of Sandra Bland. They've been interviewed over and over again. I have all of the autopsy reports, the one done by the military and the one done also independently, that the narrative that I've come up with versus the narrative, Nikki Finney, who won the National Book Award, is a poet. Her poem about Lavina Johnson was put into the congressional record, and they're pretty darn close. And to me, that's triangulation, and I don't need to re-victimize the parents of Lavina Johnson. And so that's a decision I make now with all of this training that I probably would not have made as a graduate student, just because I didn't have this kind of training yet. But the thing that I think is very clear, that through all of this and through theory, I did get to my end goal in terms of being focused in my research and in my teaching, which I'll talk about in a minute, on issues of social justice, that many, many, many people in this room are. I'm not at all special about that. But I did get there through different theoretical frameworks. the thing that they don't tell you when you're a graduate student and you get a job is that you can have very little time to ever think about research again, and so you have, if I did this actually with the amount of time you get to spend in these areas, this is the new area. Now, you may do some service as a graduate student, but it is something, and the more senior you get, the more you do. I titled the program talking also about feminist theory, teaching, and activism. But one of the things that I think is important, that like my little rubric here, is I've tried to work this activism and social justice through all of these areas. Now, there's just some things you have to do that are dead dull as a faculty member when you're doing service, because they have to be done. But there's other things that you can, so for example, right now we are revamping the entire undergraduate curriculum at Penn State. It is a horrible, horrible job, and I'm chairing it, right? But we're also having some fun. I know many of you know Brian King and Josh Inwood, and they came up with a certificate that they're calling JEDI, which is Justice, Equality, Diversity in Space. Right, but we're through some play and some activism. We are changing the undergraduate curriculum, not just in terms of structure, what goes where, and sequencing numbers and all of those kind of things that administrators do have to deal with. We're actually getting some more social justice in there into the undergraduate curriculum. And for me, it's worth then having this, gorilla around my neck, called the undergraduate curriculum. But because it's a really hard thing to do. Anybody who's working social justice, we all figure out ways to do it in our teaching. Especially if you're pulling your research into your teaching. But this activism part, is something that I had to learn. Like, I always thought activism, and I still do it. I go to the march, I hold the sign. But activism also is being there for your students. Activism is, you all know, Penn State does not have an illustrious history when it comes to sexual assault, whether it's young women on campus or young boys in locker rooms. And a lot of my activism has been on teach-ins about that, but also having special classes. A lot of times, if someone's assaulted, they get pulled out of their class until there's hearings and things. And so I actually have held special independent studies with women who couldn't be in the classroom while their cases were being heard. And to me, that's teaching and that's service, but it certainly is activism too. So my definition of activism has become very place-specific, in terms of the university and how I can implement change in that way. So, and I see my colleagues doing that also, that these four things don't have to be, it's a very static box, but these four things don't have to be that static. And again, I think that that's something that I learned here in terms of how to kind of blend these areas together. I mean, I did learn how to teach here. I did learn how to do research here. And I didn't learn a whole lot about service. Apparently, Jake reminded me that I came storming into his office at one point. There was a vote in a faculty meeting, which of course I would have no privy to, but I heard about it and I was yelling at him and asking why they voted for something that way. And I was like, oh my God, that was the great life of a grad student where you had so much freedom, you could yell at faculty, which you don't have when you become pre-tenure, And so, but also I think, as part of this too, Jamie and I were just elected to national counselors for the AAG. That's not going to be a fun job, unless Jamie knows more about it than I do. It's not going to be fun. But I think, if you read both of our platforms, why we ran, it has to do with change, it has to do with social justice, it has making the discipline better. And that's why we're doing it, right? So it takes time away from other things, but it is definitely a form of activism. So, so my last slide, and then we can have a conversation. I don't know how long I've been blathering on here. But it doesn't get easier. You just get a lot better at it as you do it. So thank you.
So, whoever, please begin.
Yes, Jake.
I'll throw a couple of comments out.
One, I want a copy of the picture of the amalgamated for my dad.
Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting to me to hear you talking about how uncomfortable you were with theory, because I'm remembering that while you were still a student here, you gave a guest talk in my wife's seminar on theory. And Carol has had guests in her classes over the years ranging from national politicians to editors of the New York Times. And she has never spoken in such glowing terms as when she was talking about how rapt you had her seminar making the connection between your theory and your research in Northern Ireland real to them. And so you may not have been comfortable, but you were already getting good at it.
Thank you. Yeah, and it was when it clicked for me, and that's what school's about, and it's still about me too right now. The things I still learn today. When it clicks and you realize how potent it can be, when it's not just jargon for jargon's sake, which drove me insane, but it really is an incredible tool to explaining issues of social justice or issues of racism and sexism, and it gives you the scope that you need to broaden that this is not just a case in Northern Ireland. And there's so many similarities. Like I said, theories of violence. I still connect all of my work right now, and but thank you. That's really nice because. It was always Carol was always a wonderful support. As other faculty were here, Bev Mullings, for example, who's no longer here, she was. I think I may have told some of you this story that when I did my practice run for my job talk, the faculty made me cry, and I was out in the hallway weeping. And Carol, not any of the faculty there in the room right now, but. Carol and Bev came out, and I remember they both grabbed me and said, "You're going to get this job." And I don't know if they believed it or not, but I did get the job. So I don't know if they knew something that I didn't know, but because it's hard. And we actually at the time I thought, oh God, look, I'm this is never going to work out for me. But the truth of the matter is, then when I did go, I still think it's a little masculinist, in terms of that kind of thing, but. I really examine my grad students, almost to that level when we're practicing with them for the job market, and they get the jobs, and I don't think have made anybody cry yet, though. So there's still time. There's a disciplining that goes on that I didn't understand, or disciplining and training I didn't understand as a grad student that I do now. So it's hard, yeah.
One comment I have in relation to your last slide, when you're talking about service, it made me think of some friends of mine who are on Facebook. There are other women scholars, probably consider themselves feminist and not a geography. And they posted something recently saying that women in the academy do more service than men, or at least modestly more, at least the study they were citing. But it seems like the flip side of that is like service, it can be dull. Some service is better than other, but a lot of service is also power. You're both becoming counselors, there's probably a lot of dull things with that, but that's power to shape the discipline, and what you're doing, it seems, at Penn State, being involved in the curriculum. Dull service taking away from research, but an enormous amount of power. That's going to be the structure in which tens of thousands of students are going to come through.
Yeah, that's very true.
You're setting the larger format in which they are going to get their undergraduate education. So it's more, I guess, a comment than anything else, but maybe kind of reflect the connection between maybe service and power.
Yeah, we just ran in the college. Geography is located in the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences at Penn State, which is, I guess it's fair to say, a hard science college that we have. The social scientists are the geographers that are in the college. And so they asked Brian King and I on a college-wide committee to look at the status of women. And we immediately expanded it because we do think the status of women is very important, but we think that there's all types of statuses that were important to look at. And this was part of the issue where people were feeling that they were being held away from certain service that did have, because you're very right, that's the other side of the issue, right? It's a real vote of confidence in my colleagues that they've put the curriculum in my hands. But the other part could say, oh, they don't really care about undergraduate, and so they're just giving it to me, So there's the other side of that too. But I've taken it, and we've been trying to change the curriculum for 20 years, and it's like an impossible thing to do, and we finally have done it. Not necessarily because of me, but because I have opened it up to all of the faculty. We got the grad students involved and said, like, what do we want to do here? We had undergraduate focus groups, and that was something I think that was different. But there's definitely power that comes with service. One of the reasons I became the department head of women's studies was that I felt strongly that there was a need at the time. It was just it was a stupid thing to do. I was 1 year of an associate professor. I had just gotten promoted and I became a department head. If I was my advisor, I would have yelled at me for doing that. But at the same time, there was a real important need, and that somebody who really, really cared about the department was going to do this. And so I did it. And yes, without a doubt, it slowed down my research trajectory. But at the same time, I learned lessons and have colleagues. And I actually do now understand how the university works, which I never really did before as a department head. And so it's a form of knowledge that I'm actually happy to have. But there was a lot of power with it. You're right. So the thing is, are you getting too much of it because of an identity, or are you being restricted from it? Is the other part of it, which is equally as important. It's a great question. Comment. Yes, Mark.
What changes would you like to see at the Association of American Geographers?
We can't be as white as we are.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at anthropology versus geography, which is one of the models I look at.
How would you change that? I mean, I've always thought that basically there's the schools that we draw our graduate students from. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we've really been able to make any significant inroads, let's say, in historical black colleges.
You're right, we haven't. We tried also at Penn State.
Yeah, and what strategies are you thinking of?
One of the things that we are doing is changing the curriculum at the undergraduate level to try to make it more appealing to students, that it's a less white curriculum, and so we're doing that, and with the hope, not that we're going to go, that we're changing at least at the undergraduate level, and that will start filtering up, and so that's one of the things we're going to do. The other thing I think is important that I want to do as a counselor, and again, this goes to mentorship, I think author meets the critics in terms of books are really important. I organized a whole bunch of them this year at the AG, but I also think there needs to be a pre-stage, especially for younger scholars, where somehow they can get input from established scholars who are good at writing books about their book before it actually goes out for review. And I think that there's a way to do that through the association, that we can, because it's harder to do everything, right? So it's harder to get your articles published. It's much harder to publish books. A lot of departments don't even value books anymore. I mean, especially with the rankings, David Harvey doesn't count, right? And so I personally feel that books are really, really important. And so that's another thing. As a discipline, I want us to start figuring out how we can do it, how we can facilitate it, and how we can make them count. So that's another kind of peeve I have about the discipline.
Amen.
Yeah, so, from a book writer. Yes.
It's kind of interesting to hear you say that, because I recall several years ago, the physical geographer Will Graff, maybe when he was AAG president, saying to physical geographers, we need to write books, because books are what make an impression. Mm-hmm. Articles kind of come and go, but a book is a thing if we don't have enough of a presence in terms of books from our part of the discipline. So it's kind of a two-sided.
It's definitely two-sided, and it's also, I mean, in terms of, well, there's a couple, and there's different ways of writing books too. So if we want to have a presence in public scholarship, as let's say the historians do and the anthropologists do, we also have to write books, and we have to write certain types of more accessible forms of books too. And I think that that's really important too as a discipline, that I'm really tired of people asking me when I say I'm a geographer, like looking at me very puzzled. I know that's not going to change overnight, but I think public scholarship certainly can help that. You know, when the public is hearing from Kaplan in terms of what geopolitics is, that's really problematic as for, for me. And so,
just to build on that, I mean, it's because the book becomes a vehicle. The book is a vehicle for so many different things in the public realm. From like you get on, reviewed in the New York Times, you get interviewed on Terry Gross, and then things, Democracy Now! I host a podcast called New Books in Geography. As far as I know, there's no new books and new articles in anthropology and new articles in geography. There's no such thing. And so the book becomes a vehicle for all these other ways. There's a reason why Kaplan, there's political reasons Kaplan's work is presented so much, but also he gets a book and then they have somebody who works for the press who gets him all these interviews.
Yeah, no, he's got an agent.
I don't know any journal that does that with your article.
Right. No, it's true. And I mean, I've seen more experimental things happening in journals with with online editorials and things like that, but they still are not going to go that far outside the immediate discipline. And so even if, let's say, very least, we want a more interdisciplinary reaction, which many of us do, depending on the journals we go into, but at the same time, it's not getting that far. And so I really think, I hope I'm not sounding old-fashioned. I think books are important, and I think that I'd like to see more of them in the discipline, and that's one of the things I'm going to try to do as counselors, see if there's a way to facilitate that for junior scholars in a way that is not in any way challenging them for tenure somewhere, because often people are told, don't write a book, it's the end of the world. Yeah.
I think it's also a matter of being willing or setting up the structures so that non-academic presses are still given weight. Like look at Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted. It wasn't published by an academic press. He just won the Pulitzer. And it's it doesn't negate the fact that it's still a brilliant piece of scholarship in its own right. But published by Crown, that's a popular press. They publish nonfiction, but would that get credit towards someone's tenure? Probably not, unless you were as successful as he was.
It really depends. It depends on the university, depends on the unit. We've had people get tenure in women's studies at Penn State for projects that would not necessarily get them tenure in other departments, and we've been able to make solid arguments for that. And for example, one of my colleagues is a poet. But yet she's in liberal arts, which has this system of. But she was able to. She published a book with an African press, and we were able to get that to count, which historically wouldn't have counted. But it's important that it's showing the impact in terms of where she does her work and how important it is to support presses, as well as on a book of poetry. And I was actually head, and it's a different argument, and you have to spend time making it, but you can make it. And so, but that's you're hitting a structure that's like trying to turn the Titanic right before the iceberg, right? I mean, these things are really hard to change. But I also don't think we should just say things can't change, even if we change a little. The point of this is saying this is generations. Right? And that's why this is really a great forum, because we can talk about, especially with the grad students, what we try, we're thinking about trying to do. We, at our cohort, try to pick up something different, and, things aren't going to change overnight, but they can change over decades. The fact that, I even, a feminist methodology class, I wouldn't 20 years ago, would have even thought about something like that. Yeah.
I guess one thing which is problematic from the standpoint of scholars who principally write books, is the issue of analytics. And I believe about 10 years ago, when the NSF was planning to survey the departments in various disciplines, my recollection is that the AAG basically said it's okay just to count articles and not count books. And
they did.
I really think of that as kind of a sellout. A problem is that we get these services like Scopus, where you don't really get books in the system, so that when they're cited, now, this whole business of citation counts, Lord knows what that means, because there's nothing, there about sort of the quality of the citation. Why is something being cited? For what reason? But I mean, one of the problems is, I guess, with the university administrators. They might not read much, but they can count. And they like things, where things count, numbers. In some ways, it's all numerology when you come down to it, but apparently it's a numerology that more and more people somehow or the other are believing in.
It is. I agree with you, Mark. But the other part of this, too, is my colleagues in GIS are equally as frustrated because they work out of proceedings that are far more rigorous than most journals, right? And those aren't counting either, And so we actually did a very big pushback. My colleague Alex Klippel, who's he's just amazing with statistics, something I'm not, and he went through and did an analysis of what it would look like with proceedings, with books, and and presented it to the dean, and the dean backed off of us and said, okay, just keep doing what you're doing then, So that was a moment, that was an intervention, because he was about to, basically say, we're not hiring human geographers anymore because we don't publish to the rate that other scientists do. And so that intervention stopped that. And this is a dean who's a geographer, and so because of these pressures and just looking at the numbers. But we got him off that page, at least for a while, and to let us keep doing what we're doing. So you can make change. It hurts sometimes.
I'm not gonna speak.
I'll say something. I heard about when Don was leaving at the holiday party, he talked about when him and Ann and Jake got hired, they came into the department and big changes were happening. So I think you were around that transition point.
Yeah, Don was interviewing as I was leaving. Yeah, so I think we shared syllabi at lunch. Yeah, so I was leaving for Penn State and he was coming in.
So you were right there on what seems to me, in my mind, not knowing the history, what seems like a big change. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the intellectual contrast, how you felt as a feminist radical scholar in that department that you started out in, and then when you left it, because I've been here for 6 years and I've already seen a lot of changes.
That is a really excellent question and something I would like to address. I was really sad when I left, and I didn't realize that, and this is what no one told me, that you have your cohort, but they don't hire the cohort. They hire one person to do something. And so this really rich kind of commune that we had here in terms of how we were thinking and what we were doing, it was me, right, at Penn State. And what was happening here at the time was much further ahead than what happened at Penn State. I was one of the first new hires. There was a bunch of retirements happening. And it was a lot of work, and again, to get back to your comment about power, the department had put me on the next 6 search committees, which was a ton of work. But we hired James McCarthy, we hired Melissa Wright, we hired Chris Benner, we hired David O'Sullivan, and that excitement that you're talking about, what happened here as I was leaving, started to happen at Penn State, and I started feeling invigorated again. But I went to a university. Oh God, are we still taping this? Right. I went to a university at the time. Was anthropology was not all the subfields that it is here, right? So I worked with a lot of cultural anthropologists. My writing group was cultural anthropologists. I didn't have that at Penn State. I mean, I looked and thought, oh, there's no one there for me. I felt very bounded when I first went. And then I discovered there was this amazing women's studies program at Penn State, and that's where I started building my cohort. And then through hires, it became very exciting. But I didn't realize that what was happening here at that time was not happening all over the country. So does that answer your question? And it made me I was very sad when for the first 6 months of Penn State, I thought, what have I done? And then we made our first hire, which I believe at the time was James McCarthy. No, it was Colin Flint, and then James McCarthy, and then Melissa, and we were cooking then, and I was happy, and people have come and gone, but we still have that base of people. We established critical thinking at Penn State. There was some resistance to it, but it eventually went away. And I have to give my senior colleagues at the time, who since have retired, a lot of credit, because they said, well, this is going to be your department. You should make it what you want. And it was a little fight, and then we got there and they said that, and then we were able to make it what we want. And that's a really important part of this kind of service, because it is a form of activism, and it's rebuilding your cohort. Now, we still are people who do things individually, right, with our grad students, but we have a like-mindedness about theory and critical thinking that, we can go out and have a drink and talk about lots of good things. So, but yeah.
One or two more questions? Because you just said have a drink that next meeting where the redoubtable Bob Wilson may be leading you in the one. Any more? Please, one or two. Do I call this to a close?
Can I ask one question? Are any of the grad students here who came to the social justice workshop? Yeah, you guys look familiar. Yeah, that's something new that we did. Jamie and Natalie and myself and Lisa Nelson and Melissa Wright. We got a bunch of grad students together at Penn State who are interested in social justice. Hopefully, we can do more of that.
I talked to Josh and would
Good.
like to do spring 18.
Perfect. Oh, and by the way, I was told to, and we're hosting the Critical Geographies conference in October. You're all invited. It's a nice geographic shift because it's been in Kentucky, so it's an easier drive for you guys to come to that. And so we'll be sending out the information about. But Josh told me before I left. He said, "Tell them all," And so we'll be at Penn State this year, and so we hope to see many of you there. And we'll do the social workshop. They'll do the workshop again. That was a lot of fun.
We'll
Yeah.
organize.
Remember its power.
There's your power, Natalie.
She's volunteering.
Well,
Are we done?
perhaps we have reached the pre-beer belly moments, in which case, please let us applaud Lorraine.